We are going to go ahead and get started again. Thank you for hanging in. Once again, I'm Dean Reuter, one of the co-editors of Liberty's Nemesis, along with John Yoo, Professor John Yoo from Berkeley. Thank you all for being here. We were told that there's not usually a lot of Q&A during these sessions, but we really did want to make it a conversation. So we're going to speak only briefly and then hopefully take questions from the audience and make it a true conversation. The book, I'm happy it's out in an election season, especially an election season like the one we have, because it not only documents the explosive growth of the federal government, it explains how we got to where we are today, why it is that the unaccountable, unelected agencies control so much of the government and so much of the government's power, and why they shouldn't. And as it explains that, it really becomes a roadmap for how to undo it, how to get back to a constitutional form of government that we all deserve, one where the people really control the levers of power rather than unelected bureaucrats. And I think John's going to talk about the election season a little bit. I also wanted to touch on something that the book doesn't discuss too much, and it's sort of under the heading of breaking news, and that's the Supreme Court vacancy. There's been a lot of discussion in the news. Everybody's heard about it. With the unfortunate, untimely passing of Justice Scalia, there's a vacancy on the court, and there's something of a showdown between the White House and the Senate, especially the Republican leadership, over the Senate's duty to advise and consent to confirm a nominee, as President Obama would have it. But I'm happy to report that the law and the Constitution are on the Senate side here. The president surely does have a duty to nominate someone, but the Senate has a co-equal duty, as a co-equal branch of government, to, in this case, operate as a check. It doesn't have any responsibility or any duty to host one-on-one meetings with a nominee, or hold a hearing, or hold a committee vote, or a floor vote. There's no timetable. It's not as if the president sends somebody over and says, we need this back next month or next Wednesday or whatever. So the Senate is perfectly well within its prerogative, and even with a proper understanding of checks and balances, it can easily be said that the role of the Senate is to check the president's power, in this instance, the appointment power. Especially, I think, when you're dealing with a third branch of government and a lifetime appointment. This is not the president appointing a secretary to the Department of Commerce. It's the president making an appointment to an independent third branch of government, and the Senate's entitled to do its full duty, which in this case might be not to act. So much of this and more is in the book, but I want to hear from my co-editor, John, about the election season, what he has to say.
Thanks, Dean. Thanks, everybody, for coming. This is not the panel on socialism. I'd be curious to hear about the difference between socialism and the Democratic Party, too. Oh, no, I'm sorry, democracy, not Democratic Party. Yeah, this is the panel on the proper role of the executive. So I thought I would start out by just talking a little bit about the implications of the presidential election and the Supreme Court vacancy and the topic of this book, which is the unchecked expansion of the government. I think that's really been the signature of the Obama years. These last 7 years has just been the massive growth of the government in domestic affairs. And you could go through lots and lots of horror stories, which the book collects, from Obamacare to the bailouts. You go on the criminal law, on and on. I think in many ways that's really one of the important issues up at stake in this election. And I have to say, I don't think Dean can address, but I can address like who I think is going to be a good candidate and who's not a good candidate. And I would think that no matter who's up or who's down in the polls, one thing that conservatives should be united on is that we all believe in narrowing the size of the federal government. That the whole point of our Constitution is to keep limits on the government so that we can all have space for individual liberty. And so that's why we call the book Liberty's Nemesis, because the nemesis of liberty really is this constantly growing federal government. And so, to me, you look at the different candidates, I guess the ones that are left: Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Donald Trump, and John Kasich from Ohio. And it seems to me that some of these candidates are much more friendly to larger national government than others. So, for example, one of the things that really struck me in the debates was Donald Trump praising the power of the government to take away private property from little old grand ladies so that they can be used for casino parking lots. I mean, to me, that you couldn't have a clearer example of somebody there who favored big government. The idea that the government should take property from one private person and give it to another private person just because it likes the project that person B is engaged in. So I gotta say, I wrote a piece in Fox News a few weeks ago saying that I thought the framers of our Constitution would be setting their wigs on fire at the idea that Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders would become president, because both of them are candidates in my mind that the Constitution was designed to prevent. On the one hand, I think the Constitution was designed not for the presidency to be just a single popularly elected official for the whole country. That's why you have this weird, crazy electoral college. The electoral college was designed to allow the states and regions of our country to have a say, so that the president wasn't just a plebiscite. On the other hand, someone like a Bernie Sanders, who, this is probably more in tune with the other panel, wants to create a socialist revolution in our country. The Constitution divides power between the three branches of government and between the federal government and the states, so that you wouldn't have one election that could just wipe a slate clean and just impose a single economic system in our country. And so the framers really, to me, would have been much more happy with someone not at the two extremes of this, not ideological extremes, but just what they represent politically. So to me, if you look at a Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio, it's now the time to ask more questions. Where do they stand on some of the examples here? The expansion of the criminal law, the expansion of regulation of the environment, the expansion, nationalization of health care, the use of the financial markets to punish industries that the government doesn't like, the use of, the use of the IRS to discriminate against groups who the government just disagrees with in terms of their viewpoint. And so I think, there's a lot of slogans in an election campaign, kind we're going through now, a lot of insults, quips. But I think now, as we're getting closer to a final choice, we should try to understand who it is that we want in terms of a candidate with their programs in terms of big government, small government, what kind of programs they want to get rid of, what kind of programs they would keep, what's their philosophy towards big government. So let me turn it over to Dean.
Well, why don't we take questions at this point, see who has something they want to ask or discuss? Yes, sir.
When I think about the expanded power of the presidency and attempts by the legislature to rein it in, I think about the War Powers Act and how that really ended up not really fulfilling its intended purpose. And we're hearing all sorts of talk about how to rein back some of the administrative state. And do you think that there's a way to prevent a War Powers Act Part 2 as far as reining in the administrative state?
So I think there's a good question. I think there's just two different subjects. So the War Powers Act and the president's powers in foreign affairs, and then the president's power in domestic affairs. I think they're very different. So I think in foreign affairs, the president's the commander-in-chief and chief executive, and that's the area where I think the framers wanted the president to act, with energy and vigorousness. But then in domestic affairs, where most of the problems have been, and I think where the book is focused, they expected the president's main job to be to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And those are the laws passed by Congress. So the area where you've seen actually President Obama go the farthest has not been in foreign affairs. Actually, in foreign affairs, he's really been trying to pull back on the presidential power. He's deferring to the courts, to Congress, to the United Nations, to other countries. Right? If you look at the deal between the U.S. and Iran, for example, he never submitted it to the Congress. He submitted it to the UN for approval. No president has ever done anything like that before. In domestic affairs, take immigration. In domestic affairs, the president's job is to carry out the immigration laws, which require the deportation, or the fancy legal word is removal, of illegal aliens, of which there might be 11 to 12 million in the country. And President Obama has said, I don't feel like doing that because I disagree. I think that there should be more exceptions to the removal laws. maybe there should, maybe there shouldn't, but Congress hasn't passed them. And the president's job is to take care that the laws are faithfully executed as written, not as he would rewrite them. So I think, the War Powers Act, I think, is a very bad law. It should be overhauled or changed. But the bigger problem, I think, is presidential power domestically, where the president's claiming the right to use the IRS to go after his enemies, or on immigration to say, I'm going to unilaterally change the quotas on who's allowed to stay and who's allowed to go. You could look for, maybe the answer is, though, like with the War Powers Act, Congress has to step in and pass more laws to more tightly constrain the president domestically because of these unprecedented efforts to expand the presidency that under Obama.
Yes, sir.
I think it's the executive orders is where the power gets abused more than anything. It's not just Obama. I mean, Bush did it too. Clinton before that. What can be done to rein that in?
Well, executive orders have been used for quite a long time. I think President Obama has perfected the use of executive orders, but not just executive orders, executive actions, presidential memoranda, and even things that are sort of less formal than an executive order. I think the whole system is run off the rails primarily for a couple of reasons. One, the states have given up power to the federal government, and once it's within the federal government, Congress is just not paying attention. It's delegating too much power to the executive branches. That's why power gets exercised at the agency level. And when the president gets frustrated by divided government, he just acts unilaterally. And Congress sits idly by. They don't do anything. They don't use the power of the purse. They don't use oversight. They don't use a budget process to rein in the executive. So there's no consequence, at least at this point, except sometimes legal action by 26 or 27 state AGs, or sometimes some public opinion fallout, but not usually even that. And the courts have sort of been complicit too, because the courts have a pretty long history of deferring to Congress's delegation, the demise of the non-delegation doctrine. This idea that Congress can't give legislative power to the executive is sort of old-fashioned now.
So the only fix is elected Congress with a spine.
Elect a Congress with a spine. You can also elect a president, this is the season for that has the strength not to exercise too much power and not to exercise outsized power that he shouldn't have.
Let me just very briefly on your point is, I think under President Obama, we're in our third wave of this. So the first wave was under President Roosevelt, the New Deal. That was the first big permanent expansion. The second wave, Wilson's the mastermind. I agree. Wilson was sort of the intellectual mastermind of it. But the first permanent big government was under FDR. The second wave was under LBJ and the Great Society. And then the third wave has been under Obama. We're living through it right now. And after each of those waves, conservatives, when they eventually took back the presidency and Congress, didn't try to roll it back. They always just said, we're going to make peace with it. We're going to live with the welfare state. We're going to contain it, but we're not going to, they never, even President Reagan never succeeded in turning it backwards. So I think that is a really good question to figure out how would, say, a President Trump or a President Rubio or Cruz or Kasich got in charge, how would they actually turn to the job of pulling back the size of the government? I think that's no Republican president has ever succeeded in doing it before.
Well, it sort of got rolled back a little bit, but it was House and Senate Republican control. Welfare reform.
Thanks for the question. So, take one more question.
Yeah, maybe we have time for a final question, if there's one more question before me. Yes, sir.
The Senate having a constitutional ability to check the president, but just not winning. If there was a Democrat elected in the fall, how far would that extend?
In time?
In terms of
Okay, last question.
any nominee.
Yeah, the question relates to the Senate's duty to confirm a nominee. There's no time limit noted in the Constitution, and there's nothing magical about there being 9 justices. The country started out with 6 justices. We've had as many as 10 at some point in time. And as recently as 2010, when Justice Elena Kagan came on the court, she had been the Solicitor General, so she recused herself in over a third of the cases that term. So more than a third of the cases in 2010 were decided by 8 justices. And cases can be held over, re-argued when there's a 9th justice in place. So I don't see a sense of urgency. I don't know if you have another answer to that.
No, I think you're exactly right.
Good. Well, thank you all so much for being here. Those of you who are here for this, certainly appreciate it. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Dean.